Like probably a lot of people who play the games, I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the Souls series. There's a thin line between challenge and frustration, and it's downright unreasonable to expect any game to be able to stay on the proper side of that line 100% of the time. The Souls series has always had its problems. Some are common throughout the games and some are unique to each entry. But the games all have their corresponding strengths as well that make up for the occasional frustrations, and have built the series up into the powerhouse it is today. But sometimes you need to look pretty hard to find the strengths of a game, whereas the flaws and frustrations will always be front and center. What I'm trying to say is that I had a really shitty time with Dark Souls 3. With how demanding the Souls games can be, small changes to the mechanics can have massive implications for how the game feels and plays. For Dark Souls 2, the combat was slowed down drastically. Combos were significantly shortened, and a relatively massive delay was put in when trying to execute a dodge after attacking that made hit-and-run tactics much less viable, by increasing the size of the window the player needed to attack safely. As utilizing the invincibility frames of the dodge maneuver to pass through enemy attacks unharmed, often referred to as iframing, is an integral mechanic of combat in the Souls games, limiting the player's ability to access it has huge repercussions on combat. Iframing is an important mechanic because it allows the players to avoid damage from an attack without moving themselves out of range for an immediate counterattack. As enemy behavior didn't change between Dark Souls 1 and 2, you pretty much had to approach combat the same way, and all the limitation on dodging really ended up doing was reduce the number of hits the player could safely make on an enemy in between dodging attacks, as well as reducing the overall responsiveness of the controls. It was stupid, and I hated it. It probably felt that much worse on account of the fact that I didn't play Dark Souls 2 until after I played Bloodborne. In Bloodborne, the sluggish combat design of Dark Souls 2 went straight out the window. Player attacks are lightning quick, you can dodge in rapid succession at a cost of much less stamina, and the sprint speed was increased considerably. Mobility, both in and out of combat, is more integral than any other Souls game, and small tweaks to enemy behavior and placement were made to accommodate it. Interestingly, iframing was also de-emphasized in Bloodborne, but in a very different way. Many enemies, and especially bosses, attack in brisk flurries, chaining attacks together more rapidly than the player can dodge, forcing them to avoid attacks by, actually getting the hell out of the way, which, with the changes made to Bloodborne's movement system, is much easier to do than in any other Souls game. Changing the established hit-and-run mechanics of the Souls games into something that, I guess, actually kind of makes sense. Is that what we've been reduced to, Bloodborne? Actual logical mechanics? That's not to say that I think iframing is an inherently bad mechanic, and it's still in Bloodborne, but requires the player to be able to recognize which attacks iframing will be an effective response to. But it's not the default response to an enemy attack, like it is in Dark Souls 3. For whatever reason, From Software took a look at the speedier gameplay of Bloodborne and said, you know what, this is still too slow. Dark Souls 3's enemies are so fucking fast, it's just stupid. For so many reasons. The lock-on camera has always been a nuisance in the Souls series, with its tendency to get stuck in walls and giving you unhelpful close-ups of monster crotches, and heaven help you if an enemy jumped into the air while you were locked onto it. But for keeping your bearings against enemies with predictable movement patterns, lock-on could be a godsend. But Dark Souls 3's monsters are so spastic that I was usually foregoing the lock-on more for fear of violent camera swing-induced nausea than merely for strategic benefit. Shields are back, but don't bother using them as most enemies can break through your guard in less than a second, now that they can attack 5 times before you can even get the camera to cooperate with you so you can face them to try to block the attack anyway. And don't you dare try to run or put some distance between you and the enemy, or just try to reposition yourself so as to figure out what the hell is even going on, because whatever you're fighting is probably faster than you and has arms that are 10 feet long to slap you with. Even with the, at the time, ferocious and aggressive monster design of Bloodborne, it was almost always within reason. There were periods of relent in their onslaughts, and the tells for different enemy attacks were much more distinct. And again, Bloodborne gave you the tools to use mobility to your advantage, even against swift foes. None of that applies to Dark Souls 3. Enemies are inescapable and unrelenting. tells are near non-existent in some cases, and perhaps most crucially, you are not as mobile as you were in Bloodborne. The mechanics were changed to make you more mobile than you were in previous Dark Souls games, but not enough, in my opinion, to justify the ridiculously fast enemies. Hell, even the blood-starved beast, the monster that, for me, exemplifies the differences between Dark Souls and Bloodborne's enemy design, in all its savage and ferocious assault, feels like a sleepy puppy next to an enemy that is apparently not even a boss, the Boreal Knight. Stop it! Stop it! Just fucking stop! God damn it! There was one mercy offered to players in Dark Souls 3, however, and wouldn't you know it, I hate that too. The portion of time that you spend invincible while dodging has been increased, making iframing somewhat easier. But since iframing is your only viable means of avoiding damage in many cases, and enemies flail around like they're covered in fire ants, and fire, you spend way too much time rolling around like a total doofus. Iframing is already a silly mechanic, but its more reserved role in earlier Souls games did a lot to cover that up. Here it often feels like you're not playing some somber action RPG so much as a Bayonetta clone, which, now that I've said that, it doesn't actually sound like much of a criticism. My point is, you spend way too much damn time rolling. Actually getting out of the way of enemy attacks is often impossible, and with tells being so subtle / non-existent, I often felt like blindly rolling around was my only option as I desperately hoped for some kind of opening to, if not attack, try to get some handle on the situation. I really don't feel having enemies this frenetic and persistent was accommodated properly in the mechanics. Combat in Dark Souls 3 feels like going to see a band you like play live, and then they start to play your favorite of their songs, but they play it at like double the tempo, and it's just, ugh. One of the things I most often find being criticized about Dark Souls 2 is the approach that was taken to its level design. In Dark Souls 1, the progress you were making through the areas was often in the form of opening shortcuts, by kicking down obnoxiously out of reach ladders or opening doors that can only be unlocked on one side, which seem to exist only in video games. These shortcut paths would reduce the number of enemies or hazards you needed to surpass on future attempts, and would improve your chances of making it to the boss or just to the next big encounter with your Estus flask that much fuller. This might be just my impression of playing, but as I progressed through areas this way, I felt like I was sort of conquering them, and making them easier to explore. Learning the ins and outs of each encounter could lead to the opportunity to bypass them in the future, and this steady and easy to understand process made up a large part of my enjoyment of Dark Souls 1, as it offered a palpable sense of respite from the game's brutal difficulty. I didn't feel that cycle of stress and relief in Dark Souls 2 at all. I was kinda just pissed off the whole time. Dark Souls 2 had some shortcut opening, but it was mostly just go until you find the next bonfire. It's just boring, and Dark Souls 3 as well has some of the Dark Souls 1-esque shortcut opening, but more often than not, it's just more bonfire to bonfire exploration. Yeah, it's not that different in the long run, I guess, but it just feels boring to me. I guess I should say some nice things too. Dark Souls 3 is pretty as hell. It kinda runs like shit on console, but what are you gonna do? To gush on Bloodborne some more, perhaps even more than the mechanical changes, the difference in the amount of detail in the game's world and that of Dark Souls 1 really struck me. This level of detail was carried over into Dark Souls 3 to great effect. Even if I have some issues with how the areas are laid out, all the little environment pieces and interesting views make exploring these areas very enjoyable, at least until you run into another frustrating enemy. And even with the comparatively narrow scope of Dark Souls' medieval aesthetic, there are a lot of really interesting and creatively designed things that will kick your ass in Dark Souls 3, whereas previous Dark Souls foes were kind of almost exclusively just knights. And the new weapon skills are cool, adding some more personality to each weapon and giving them utility beyond just their stats. And the music is fantastic. It always struck me as a bit odd how understated the music in Dark Souls is, given the prestigious resume of its composer, Motoi Sakuraba. Did I pronounce that right? Probably not. What music I heard through my own echoing profanity was downright awe-inspiring. I didn't have much nice to say, but I'll still give Dark Souls 3 a 2 out of 4. Underneath the diamond-hard, spiked, razor-wire-wrapped candy shell of this game, I definitely still did find that small, sweet morsel of what I love about the Souls games. And the visual design is top-notch, but just, please, slow down. My aging heart can't take it. Let Bloodborne be the fast one and go back to Dark Souls 1 speeds. Also, not enough ladders. If Dark Souls 1 is the just right bowl of porridge, 2 is the one that's frozen solid in the bowl, and 3 is boiling hot with an entire bottle of sriracha poured in it, and the bowl is probably also booby-trapped. And of course, Bloodborne is the bowl of something that is clearly not porridge at all, or any kind of food or substance that should exist on this or any other world. A slowly pulsing, twitching mass that I feel at once disgusted and enthralled by, afraid that to look away would be to forsake all that I love and cherish, and as I stare into the writhing mass, its spasms faintly accelerating, I am overcome by a sense of cosmic dread as I submit myself to the fact that we are all nothing but blades of grass in the wind, at the mercy of forces and beings that would explode our minds from the inside out if we even began to understand their machinations. So, more of that, please. Hey, thanks for watching and listening to me whine about Dark Souls for 10 minutes. Whining is something I happen to be pretty dang good at, if I say so myself, and I can guarantee there'll be plenty more on the way, so maybe subscribe. Wait, that's not a very good sell, is it? Yeah, I got nothing.